Margaret Holloway adjusted her reading glasses and squinted at the faded daguerreotype that had arrived in yesterday's donation box. As head archivist at the Whitmore Historical Society, she had examined thousands of old photographs, but something about this particular 1899 family portrait nagged at her. The sepia-toned image showed a well-dressed Victorian family of 6, arranged formally in their parlor. Parents, grandparents, and 2 children posed with the rigid composure typical of the era. She'd initially catalogued it as a standard period piece until her magnifying glass caught something peculiar. In the ornate silver locket worn by the family matriarch, there appeared to be a reflection, not of the photographer or the room, but of a 7th figure, someone who wasn't present in the main photograph. Margaret set down her magnifying glass and rubbed her tired eyes. After 30 years of archival work, she thought she had seen everything. But this reflection showed the distinct outline of a person standing behind the family group, barely visible in the polished surface of the locket. The figure appeared translucent, almost ethereal, with indistinct features that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "David, could you come look at this?" She called her younger colleague. David Chen, a 28-year-old digital preservation specialist, rolled his chair over from his computer workstation. His expertise in photographic enhancement had proven invaluable to the Historical Society's digitization project. "What do you have, Margaret?" She handed him the photograph and pointed to the locket. "Tell me what you see in that reflection." David examined the image closely, then looked up with raised eyebrows. "That's unusual. There's definitely someone there who's not in the main photograph. Could be a photographic artifact from the development process, but the positioning seems too deliberate." "My thoughts exactly. Can you enhance it digitally?" David carefully placed the photograph on his high-resolution scanner. "Let me get this into the computer and see what we can pull out." 20 minutes later, they both stared at David's monitor in silence. The digital enhancement had revealed more detail, but rather than solving the mystery, it had deepened it. The figure in the reflection was clearly humanoid, wearing what appeared to be beyond period clothing, but their face remained frustratingly obscured. More disturbing was that the figure seemed to be reaching toward the family, as if trying to touch them. "I've cross-referenced this family in our records," David said, pulling up another window on his screen. "The Ashfords. Prominent local merchants. Well-documented family with extensive records. According to everything we have, only 6 people lived in that household in 1899, exactly who we see in the main photograph." Margaret leaned back in her chair, troubled. Then who is in the reflection? Over the next few days, Margaret found herself returning to the photograph repeatedly. Something about that mysterious 7th figure haunted her thoughts. She decided to dig deeper into the Ashford family records, hoping to find some explanation. Her breakthrough came when she contacted the Essex County Historical Society, which housed records from several dissolved local organizations. They had recently acquired materials from the defunct Millbrook Women's Literary Circle, including personal papers and journals dating back to the 1890s. "We have a journal that might interest you," the Essex County archivist told her over the phone. It belonged to Sarah Ashford, the youngest daughter in that family. The entries from 1899 are quite unusual. Margaret drove to Essex County that afternoon, her anticipation building with each mile. The journal was a small, leather-bound book with delicate pages that crackled as she carefully opened it. Sarah Ashford's careful penmanship filled the yellowed pages with accounts of daily life, family gatherings, and social events. The entries from early 1899 began normally enough. Descriptions of household routines, visits from neighbors, preparations for various social occasions. But by March, a new element appeared in Sarah's writing. March the 15th, 1899. There is a new member of our household, though father and mother do not speak of them. I see them sometimes when we gather for meals or portraits. They are very quiet and seem to watch us with great attention. I think they might be lonely. Margaret's pulse quickened as she read further. March 28th, 1899. The quiet one was present again today during our family reading time. They stood behind Mother's chair, but when I mentioned them to William, he looked at me strangely and said he saw no one. Perhaps children are more sensitive to such things. April 10th, 1899. I have begun calling our silent observer the whisperer, for sometimes I hear soft murmuring when they are near, though I cannot make out the words. They seem particularly drawn to our family gatherings, always watching, always present when we are all together. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she turned to the pages. Sarah's entries grew increasingly detailed and unsettling. April 22nd, 1899. The whisperer grows more restless. Yesterday, during Sunday dinner, I saw them reaching toward father. Though their hand passed through him like smoke, they seemed to be trying to communicate something, but I cannot understand what. May 1st, 1899. Mother has announced we shall have a family portrait taken next week. When I mentioned the whisperer should be included, she grew very pale and told me never to speak of such things again. But I know they will be there. They are always there when we are all together. The final entry was dated May 15th, 1899, exactly when the family portrait had been taken, according to the photographer's mark on the back. May 15th, 1899. The portrait session was today. As expected, the whisperer was present, standing behind our group as the photographer prepared his equipment. They seemed more agitated than usual, pressing forward as if trying to step into our circle. During the long exposure, I felt a strange chill, and the whisperer appeared to be struggling, as though fighting against invisible bonds. Most disturbing of all, as we held our poses, I heard them whisper, clearly for the first time, "Let me out." Margaret sat back, her mind racing. Sarah's account perfectly explained the figure in the locket's reflection. Someone present during the portrait session, but invisible to most of the family. But the journal raised more questions than it answered. Who or what was this whisperer? And why could only Sarah see them clearly? She photographed the relevant pages and returned to Whitmore, where she shared her findings with David. Together, they pored over Sarah's journal entries, trying to piece together the mystery. "There has to be more," David said. "This journal just ends abruptly after the portrait entry. What happened to the family after that?" Margaret had been wondering the same thing. Let me check with some other local archives. Maybe someone has additional Ashford family materials. Her persistence paid off 2 days later when she discovered that Sarah's journal had a hidden compartment in its back cover. The leather binding had been cleverly designed to conceal a small space, and tucked inside was a folded piece of paper in different handwriting, more formal and mature than Sarah's youthful script. Margaret carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The note was signed E. Ashford. Eleanor Ashford, the family matriarch whose locket had contained the mysterious reflection. To whoever may find this record, what my daughter Sarah perceived as the whisperer was no ghost or wandering spirit, but something far more complex. In our desperation to protect our family from a series of misfortunes, failed business ventures, illness, and other calamities. My husband and I sought help from sources we should have left undisturbed. We were introduced to an elderly woman who claimed knowledge of ancient protective rituals. She promised us a guardian spirit that would shield our family from harm, but the binding required a significant sacrifice. The entity would be tethered to our household, trapped between worlds, unable to find peace until the ritual was properly concluded. The family portrait was meant to complete the binding, capturing not just our likenesses, but sealing the guardian to our protection permanently. And the photographer's chemicals and silver were supposed to create a mystical anchor, with Eleanor's silver locket serving as the focal point. But something went wrong during the session. The guardian began fighting against the binding, trying to break free rather than accept its role as protector. Sarah's sensitivity allowed her to see the struggle that the rest of us could only sense as a growing unease. The portrait captured the exact moment of the entity's rebellion, not a peaceful guardian accepting its duty, but a trapped being desperately trying to escape its bonds. The reflection in my locket shows its attempt to break through into our world fully. Margaret's hands shook as she read the final paragraph. I fear we have made a terrible mistake. The ritual has not given us a protector, but created a prison for something that grows more desperate and angry with each passing day. The woman who helped us has disappeared, and we have no knowledge of how to safely release what we have bound. I pray that whoever finds this will have the wisdom we lacked, for I fear what will happen when the binding finally fails. The note ended there, leaving Margaret and David with more questions than answers. We need to find out what happened to the Ashford family after this, David said grimly. If Eleanor was right about the binding failing. Their search led them to the Millbrook Gazette archives, housed in the basement of the town library. Margaret and David spent hours scrolling through microfilm, looking for any mention of the Ashford family after May 1899. They found their answer in the February 3rd, 1900 edition, buried in a small article on page 4. Mysterious fire destroys Ashford Wing. A peculiar fire destroyed the east wing of the prominent Ashford family residence on Elm Street late Tuesday evening. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights and hearing unusual sounds from the property before flames were observed. The fire appeared to burn with unusual intensity, completely consuming the affected section of the house while leaving the rest of the structure untouched. Most remarkably, the Ashford family appears to have vacated the property sometime before the incident. Neighbors report not having seen any family members for several weeks, and their current whereabouts remain unknown. The fire's cause has been deemed undeterminable by local authorities. The remaining portion of the house has been sold to settle outstanding debts, with all proceeds going to creditors. No forwarding address has been provided for the family. David leaned back in his chair. They disappeared. The whole family just vanished. Margaret stared at the screen, piecing together the timeline. Look at the dates. Sarah's last journal entry was May 15th, 1899, when the portrait was taken. Eleanor's note must have been written sometime after that, probably when she realized the binding was failing. By February 1900, they were gone, and part of their house had burned under mysterious circumstances. You think the entity finally broke free? Margaret looked at the photograph of the family portrait, which David had printed and pinned to their research board. In the enhanced version, the figure in the locket's reflection seemed almost to be pressing against the surface, trapped behind the silver like an insect in amber. I think Eleanor was right to be afraid, Margaret said quietly. They tried to bind something they didn't understand, using rituals they couldn't control. The portrait wasn't just a family photograph, it was the final component of a supernatural trap. But the trap was failing, even as it was being created. And the fire, Margaret studied Eleanor's note again. She wrote about the entity growing more desperate and angry as the binding held it. When it finally broke free, she gestured toward the newspaper article. Maybe that fire wasn't an accident. Maybe it was the entity's way of destroying the anchor that had held it prisoner. David enhanced the photograph one final time, adjusting the contrast and brightness to bring out every possible detail. The figure in the locket's reflection became clearer, and both archivists could see what they had missed before. The entity's hands were pressed against the inner surface of the reflection, as if pushing against glass. It's not trying to reach toward the family, David realized. It's trying to break through the reflection itself. Margaret nodded grimly. The locket wasn't just reflecting the entity's image, it was containing it. And this photograph captured the exact moment it was fighting to escape. They sat in silence, contemplating the implications of their discovery. The Ashford family portrait wasn't simply a historical curiosity. It was evidence of a supernatural imprisonment that had ultimately failed, leading to the mysterious disappearance of an entire family and the destruction of their home. What do we do with this information? David asked. Margaret carefully returned the photograph to its archival sleeve. We document everything we found and preserve it for future researchers, but more importantly, we remember that this portrait isn't just a window into the past. It's a warning about the dangers of trying to control forces beyond our understanding. As she filed away their research, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the silver reflection of that antique locket, something was still watching, still waiting, trapped in a moment of desperate rebellion, captured forever in silver and light. So the entity might have won its freedom in 1900, but its struggle remained frozen in the photograph, a testament to the Ashford family's tragic attempt to bind the unbindable. The photograph now rested in the Historical Society's climate-controlled archives, catalogued and preserved for posterity. But sometimes when Margaret worked late in the evening, she thought she could feel something watching her from within those carefully organized filing cabinets, patient and eternal, waiting for someone else to peer too closely into that mysterious reflection and perhaps understand what the Ashfords had truly unleashed upon themselves in their desperate quest for protection. 3 weeks after their discovery, Margaret received an unexpected phone call. A woman claiming to be a descendant of the Ashford family had heard about their research through genealogy networks. She wanted to visit the Historical Society and see the portrait for herself, explaining that her great-great-grandmother had left behind stories about the family's sudden departure from Millbrook. As Margaret scheduled the appointment, she found herself wondering whether some mysteries were better left undisturbed and whether the Ashford legacy continued to influence the living through connections that transcended time and blood. The descendant, who introduced herself as Victoria Ashford Morrison, arrived on a gray Thursday morning carrying a weathered leather satchel. She was a woman in her 60s with piercing blue eyes that seemed unnervingly familiar to Margaret, eyes that matched those of Eleanor Ashford in the portrait. Victoria explained that her family had maintained oral traditions about their ancestors' abrupt exodus from Millbrook, stories dismissed as folklore until she learned of Margaret and David's research. She had brought with her additional family documents that might shed light on the mystery, including letters written after the family's disappearance that revealed they had settled briefly in 3 different states before vanishing entirely from historical records.